They say every family has secrets, but I never expected ours to be hidden in plain sight. A dusty, forgotten diary in the attic wasn't just a window into the past, it was a door to betrayal. As I read the entries, each one more damning than the last, I realized this wasn't just about old mistakes. This was about my life, my identity, and a truth so devastating it would tear us apart forever. The summer I turned 30 was supposed to be a time of celebration, a milestone, as my mother had put it, when life really begins. Instead, it became the year everything unraveled. It started innocently enough during a weekend visit to my parents' house. My younger sister, Rachel, had asked for help cleaning out the attic, a task my mother had put off for years. Boxes of old photographs, childhood toys, and forgotten knickknacks crowded the space, their musty smell filling the air. "Hey, check this out," Rachel said, pulling a tattered leather-bound book from a stack of papers. "What is it?" I asked, brushing dust from the cover. She shrugged. "Looks like an old diary." The diary belonged to my father, dated decades before I was born. At first it seemed harmless, accounts of his college days, his early relationship with my mother, and anecdotes about their small-town life. But as I flipped through the pages, I stumbled upon entries that made my stomach twist. The Revelation 1 entry, in particular, caught my attention. "She told me the truth today. After all these years, I still don't know what to think. How do you forgive someone for something like this? How do you move forward when every time you look at them you see a lie?" The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Who was she? What truth had she told? I read on and the pieces began to fall into place. The entries were vague but consistent, referring to a betrayal that had fractured my father's trust in my mother. Sometimes I wonder if I would have been happier not knowing. Ignorance really is bliss. My heart raced as questions flooded my mind. What had my mother done? And why had my father stayed with her if the betrayal was so unforgivable? A lingering doubt. I didn't confront my parents right away. Instead, I slipped the diary into my bag, promising myself I'd read it more thoroughly later. That night, I lay in bed, replaying the entries in my mind. My parents had always seemed like the picture of stability, a solid marriage, a warm home, and a partnership that had withstood the test of time. But the diary painted a different picture, one of resentment and buried secrets. I couldn't shake the feeling that this truth my father had written about wasn't just a momentary lapse in judgment. It felt bigger, more insidious. The whisper of a clue. The next morning, I called Rachel, who had stayed behind to finish cleaning the attic. "Did you find anything else interesting?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Not really," she said, "just a bunch of old letters and some photo albums." "Oh, and there was this envelope with our names on it, but I didn't open it." My pulse quickened. "What do you mean, our names?" "It was addressed to both of us," she said. "It looked like Dad's handwriting. I left it on the kitchen table." I hung up and drove to my parents' house, my mind racing. If the envelope contained more clues about the diary's contents, I needed to see it. A chilling discovery. When I arrived, the envelope was gone. My mother was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner, her movements brisk and practiced. "Hey, Mum," I said, trying to sound casual. "Rachel said there was an envelope on the table with my name on it. Do you know where it is?" She froze for a fraction of a second before resuming her task. "I didn't see anything like that," she said, her tone even. Her reaction set off alarm bells in my head. My mother was an excellent liar, a skill I had always admired when it came to her white lies about surprise parties or last-minute gifts. But this felt different. The confrontation. That evening, as my father returned home from work, I decided I couldn't wait any longer. "Dad," I began, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. "I found something in the attic, your old diary. There were some entries that didn't make sense." He stiffened, his eyes darting to my mother, who had stopped folding laundry and was now watching us intently. "What did you read?" he asked, his tone sharp. Enough to know there's something you haven't told us, I said. Something big. My father sighed, running a hand through his greying hair. It's not what you think, he said quietly. Then tell me what it is, I demanded. The half-truth. Over the next hour, my father reluctantly recounted a version of events that felt carefully curated. He admitted there had been a betrayal early in their marriage, but insisted it had been resolved. It was a mistake, he said, glancing at my mother, whose face remained unreadable. But we worked through it. What kind of mistake? I pressed. That's not important, he said firmly. What matters is that it's in the past. But the diary didn't read like a story of resolution. It read like a wound that had never fully healed. Unraveling the lie. Unsatisfied with their answers, I decided to dig deeper. Over the next few weeks, I pored over the diary, cross-referencing dates and details with old photos and letters. Slowly, a pattern began to emerge. The betrayal wasn't just about infidelity or broken promises, it was about me. One particular entry confirmed my worst fear. She swore I was the father, but I don't know if I'll ever believe her. Every time I see him, I wonder whose blood really runs through his veins. My hands trembled as I read the words. My father had questioned my paternity. The breaking point confronting my parents again wasn't just a choice, it was a necessity. This time I refused to let them deflect or dismiss my questions. Am I even your son? I asked my father, my voice trembling with anger. His face crumpled, and for the first time I saw tears in his eyes. You're my son, he said, no matter what. That's not an answer, I said, turning to my mother. Tell me the truth, now. My mother's stoic facade cracked, and she began to cry. I don't know, she admitted. I don't know if he's your father. The fallout. Their confession shattered me. My entire identity, my place in the family felt like a lie. The people I had trusted most had kept this secret for decades, letting it fester beneath the surface of our lives. As I walked out of the house that night, I felt like I was leaving behind more than just my parents. I was leaving behind the person I thought I was. Walking out of my parents' house that night, I felt unmoored, as if the ground beneath me had shifted into quicksand. My father's hesitant words and my mother's tearful admission echoed in my mind. I don't know if he's your father. It wasn't just the words, it was the years of deception, the intentional omission of a truth that could have changed the course of my life. If my own parents couldn't be trusted, who could? But I wasn't going to drown in their lies. If they wouldn't give me the truth, I'd find it myself. The search begins. The next morning, I made a list of everyone who might have answers. Old family friends, distant relatives, anyone who had been part of my parents' lives during the time in question. I started with my Aunt Diane, my mother's younger sister. She had always been the outspoken one in the family, unafraid to speak her mind. When I called her, she sounded surprised but eager to talk. Of course, come by, she said. It's been too long. Her warmth felt genuine, but I couldn't shake the suspicion that she, too, might have been part of the cover-up. Aunt Diane's house. When I arrived at Aunt Diane's cozy suburban home, she greeted me with a hug and a wide smile. You've grown so much, she said, stepping back to look at me. You look more and more like your father every day. Her words stung, though I knew she meant them as a compliment. That's actually why I'm here, I said, trying to sound casual. Over coffee, I broached the subject carefully. Do you remember much about Mum and Dad's early years? I asked. Diane laughed. Of course. Your mum was always the adventurous one, and your dad was the steady anchor. They balanced each other out. Her response was polished, rehearsed. I decided to push further. Did they ever have problems? I asked, my voice steady. Diane hesitated, her smile faltering. What's this about? She asked. I took a deep breath. I found Dad's old diary. There's something in it about a betrayal. I need to know what really happened. The first clue. Diane's expression darkened, and she set her coffee cup down. "Your mum made a mistake," she said finally. "She was young, and your dad, well, he wasn't always as attentive as he should have been." "What kind of mistake?" I pressed. She sighed. "There was someone else, a man your mum knew before she married your dad. His name was Jack." The name hit me like a thunderclap. I had never heard of Jack before, but the way Diane said it made it clear he wasn't just a passing fling. Was she with him after she married Dad?" I asked. Diane nodded slowly. "It was a complicated time. Jack came back into her life briefly, and things happened." Piecing together the past. With Diane's reluctant confession, I finally had a name to work with. Jack, the man who might have been my father. But Diane couldn't or wouldn't tell me more. "You'll have to talk to your mum," she said, her tone firm. "It's not my story to tell." As I drove home, my mind raced with possibilities. Who was Jack? Was he still alive? And if he was, would he even know about me? A visit to the lawyer. The next day, I met with a lawyer to request a copy of my birth certificate and any related legal documents. I hoped they might provide a clue, even if it was just a name. When I received the documents, my heart sank. Under father's name, only my dad's name was listed. There was no mention of Jack, no hint of the tangled web my mother had created. But the absence of evidence didn't dissuade me. It only made me more determined to find the truth. The confrontation with Mom. I returned to my parents' house that evening, determined to confront my mother. She was alone in the living room, flipping through an old photo album. "Mum," I said, startling her. She looked up, her face pale. "What are you doing here?" "I talked to Aunt Diane," I said, sitting down across from her. "I know about Jack." Her hands trembled as she closed the album. "I didn't want you to find out this way," she said quietly. "Find out what?" I demanded. "That my father might not be my father, that you've been lying to me my entire life." Tears filled her eyes. "It wasn't like that," she said. "Jack and it was a mistake, but your father loved you from the moment you were born. He raised you as his own." Her words did little to comfort me. "Where is Jack now?" I asked. She hesitated before answering. "I don't know. We haven't spoken in decades." Tracking down Jack. With no help from my mother, I turned to James, a private investigator recommended by a friend. I gave him the little information I had: Jack's name, the approximate timeline, and a few vague details from Diane. "It's a long shot," James said, "but I'll see what I can find." 2 weeks later, James called with news. "I found him," he said. "Jack Sullivan lives in a small town about 2 hours from here." My heart raced. "Does he know about me?" James paused. "That's the thing, he doesn't. But I think you should hear it from him directly." The first meeting. When I arrived in Jackstown, my nerves were on edge. I parked outside a modest house, the lawn neatly trimmed, and the porch adorned with potted plants. Jack answered the door after my first knock. He was older than I expected, his hair greying at the temples, but his eyes were sharp and full of curiosity. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice cautious. "I think you might be my father," I said, my words coming out in a rush. Jack stared at me, his expression unreadable. "Come in," he said finally, a confession and a twist. As we sat in his cozy living room, I explained everything: my father's diary, my mother's confession, and my search for answers. Jack listened quietly, his face a mixture of sadness and something I couldn't quite place. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, letting out a long sigh. "I loved your mother," he said finally. "We were young and stupid, and I made a lot of mistakes, but I never knew there was a chance you were mine." His words felt honest, but they didn't give me the closure I needed. "Will you take a DNA test?" I asked. He nodded. "Of course." The truth at last. The results of the DNA test arrived a week later. Jack wasn't my father. The news left me reeling. If Jack wasn't my father, then who was? And why had my mother been so evasive about the truth? As I stared at the results, a thought occurred to me, a dark, unsettling possibility. What if the betrayal in my parents' marriage wasn't just about infidelity? What if it was something far worse? Jack's absence as my biological father should have brought relief, but it left an unsettling void instead. The door to my past, cracked open by the discovery of my father's diary, was now a gaping chasm filled with questions. My mother's tears and my father's silence had painted a portrait of regret. But now I began to wonder, was there remorse about the betrayal, or had they been hiding something much darker all along? A quiet revelation. After receiving the DNA results, I sat alone in my apartment, replaying every word my mother had said, every clue buried in my father's journal. Something didn't add up. I couldn't let it go. I called James, the private investigator, desperate for direction. "I need you to keep digging," I told him. "If it's not Jack, then who? And why has my family worked so hard to bury this?" James was hesitant. "You're asking me to tear apart the fabric of your parents' lives," he said. "Are you sure you're ready for what I might find?" I didn't hesitate. Yes. The stranger in the photos. A few days later, James called me with a lead. "You need to come see this," he said, his voice unusually grave. When I arrived at his office, he handed me a stack of old photographs. They were from my parents' early years, many of them candid snapshots from family gatherings. "Look at this," James said, pointing to a man in several of the photos. He was tall, with sharp features and an easy smile. "Who is that?" I asked, flipping through the images. "That's Michael Stanton," James said, "your father's best friend from college." I frowned. I had never heard of Michael before. My father's stories about his youth had always revolved around sports, academics, and meeting my mother. Michael's name had never come up. "Why is he important?" I asked. James hesitated before answering. "Because according to public records, Michael disappeared in 1985, the same year you were born." The ghost of Michael Stanton. The revelation about Michael Stanton sent a chill down my spine. His presence in the photos, juxtaposed against his sudden disappearance, felt like a piece of the puzzle snapping into place. "Do you think he could be my father?" I asked James. "It's possible," James said, "but there's more to the story. Michael's disappearance wasn't just a case of someone leaving town, it was suspicious." "What do you mean?" James pulled out a police report. "He vanished without a trace after a heated argument with your father, witnessed by several people. The police investigated, but there wasn't enough evidence to press charges. Your father told them Michael left voluntarily." I sat back, stunned. "You think my father had something to do with it?" "I think," James said carefully, "that your father and Michael were connected in ways you don't yet understand." Confronting the past. The next day, I returned to my parents' house, the weight of what I'd learned pressing heavily on my chest. My father was in the garage, tinkering with his tools like nothing had changed. "Can we talk?" I asked, my voice steady but cold. He looked up, his expression guarded. "About what?" "About Michael Stanton," I said. His reaction was instant. His body stiffened, and his hands froze mid-motion. "What about him?" "Why did he disappear the year I was born?" I asked, my words cutting through the air like a blade. "What happened between the two of you?" A shocking admission. My father sighed heavily, wiping his hands on a rag as he sat down. "Michael and I were close," he began, his voice strained. "Too close, maybe. We did everything together. College, sports, even working at the same firm after graduation." "But," I pressed. He hesitated before continuing. "Michael was in love with your mother. They dated before she and I got together. When she chose me, he didn't take it well. Things were tense between us for years, but we kept up appearances. And then she got pregnant," he said, his voice breaking. "And Michael started showing up unannounced, saying things that didn't make sense. He claimed the baby wasn't mine." I felt the floor drop out from under me. You think he was my father? I didn't want to believe it, my father said, but the timing, it was too close. The night Michael disappeared. What happened to him? I asked, my voice trembling. My father stared at the ground, his jaw tight. He confronted me one night, drunk and angry. He said he wasn't going to let me raise his child. We fought. It got physical. And? He left, my father said. That's the last time I saw him. The words felt rehearsed, like a story he had told himself so many times he almost believed it. But there was something in his eyes, something that told me he wasn't giving me the whole truth. A mother's guilt. That evening, I cornered my mother in the kitchen. What aren't you telling me? I demanded. I know about Michael. I know about the fight. What happened to him? She turned pale, her hands gripping the counter for support. He's gone, she said softly. Gone how? Tears streamed down her face as she finally broke. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, she said. He wouldn't let it go. He kept threatening to tell everyone, to take you away from us. Her voice cracked. Your father didn't mean to hurt him. It was an accident. But when Michael fell, he didn't get back up. The secret burial. The truth spilled out in a torrent of sobs. My parents had buried Michael's body in a remote part of our property, desperate to hide the evidence. They had spent decades living with the weight of their crime, building their lives on a foundation of lies and guilt. A devastating twist. As I listened to my mother's confession, a new thought struck me, one so horrifying that it left me breathless. If Michael is dead, I said slowly, then how do you explain this? I pulled out my phone and showed her the photos James had taken of a man matching Michael's description, alive and well in another state. My mother gasped, her face a mask of shock. That's impossible, she whispered. Is it? I asked, my voice cold. Or did he let you believe he was dead to punish you for what you did? The image of Michael Stanton, alive and living quietly in another state, turned everything I thought I knew upside down. If my parents had spent decades believing they had buried him, then Michael's survival wasn't just a revelation, it was a game changer. It meant that the man they feared, the man whose shadow had haunted their marriage and my identity, had been watching us from afar. But why? And why had he chosen to let us believe he was dead? The only way to get answers was to confront him. The decision I spent the night grappling with the weight of what I had uncovered. My parents had admitted to a crime they thought they had committed, an unthinkable act that had shaped their lives and mine. But Michael's survival raised questions even they couldn't answer. By morning, I knew what I had to do. I called James. I need to meet him, I said. James was hesitant. This could be dangerous, he warned. Michael's been in hiding for a reason. He may not welcome your presence. I don't care, I said firmly. I need the truth. Tracking Michael. With James's help, I learned that Michael was living under an assumed name in a small town 3 states away. He worked as a carpenter, kept to himself, and had no social media presence. It's like he's erased his old life, James said. I nodded, the pieces starting to fall into place. Until now. We drove out together, the miles passing in tense silence. My mind raced with questions. Would he recognize me? Would he deny everything? Or would he confirm my worst fears, that my life had been a lie? The confrontation. When we arrived in Michaelstown, it was nearly dusk. His house was modest, tucked away at the end of a quiet street. I parked a few houses down, my heart pounding as I stared at the front door. You don't have to do this, James said. Yes, I do, I replied, stepping out of the car. I walked up to the door and knocked, my pulse thundering in my ears. The seconds stretched into an eternity before the door opened, revealing a man who looked both familiar and foreign. Michael Stanton? I asked, my voice steady despite the chaos inside me. His eyes narrowed, and for a moment he said nothing. Then he nodded. Who's asking? I think you know, I said, holding his gaze. The first words. Michael stepped aside, gesturing for me to enter. The house was sparse but comfortable, with the faint smell of wood shavings lingering in the air. You're her son, he said finally, his voice low. I can see it in your eyes. I swallowed hard. You knew about me? Michael nodded, sinking into a chair. I knew, but I stayed away. I thought it was for the best. The best? I repeated, anger rising in my chest. You let my parents believe you were dead. You let them live with guilt and lies for decades. How is that the best? Michael's version of the story. Michael sighed, running a hand through his hair. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, he said. That night, when your father and I fought, things got out of hand. I fell, hit my head, I blacked out. When I woke up, they were gone. Gone? I asked, incredulous. They must have thought I was dead, he said, but I wasn't. And by the time I recovered, I realized there was no going back. Your mother had chosen your father, and they had built a life together. There was no place for me in it. So you disappeared, I said bitterly. Michael nodded. I thought it was better for everyone, but I kept tabs on you. I wanted to make sure you were okay. A shocking revelation. As I processed his words, a new thought occurred to me, a possibility so chilling that it stopped me cold. If you've been watching us, I said slowly, then why didn't you step in? Why didn't you tell me the truth? Michael hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. Because I didn't need to, he said finally. What does that mean? I demanded. It means, he said, his voice heavy with regret, that your father was right to question your paternity. I'm not your father either. The twist. The room spun as his words sank in. What are you talking about? I asked, my voice shaking. Michael leaned forward, his expression pained. Your mother had another secret. There was someone else, someone she never told either of us about. That's why I left. I realized she had been playing both of us. Neither of us was your father. My chest tightened as a million questions flooded my mind. Who? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Michael shook his head. I don't know, she never said, but I think she was protecting him. Whoever he was dangerous. The unfinished puzzle. Michael's revelation left me reeling. My search for answers had only led to more questions, each one more unsettling than the last. If Michael wasn't my father, and my dad wasn't either, then who was? And why had my mother gone to such lengths to keep his identity a secret? As I left Michael's house that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The threatening note. When I returned home, there was an envelope waiting for me on my doorstep. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a chilling message. Stop digging, or you'll regret it. The note confirmed what I had already suspected. The truth wasn't just buried, it was guarded, and whoever was protecting it wasn't going to let me uncover it without a fight. The threatening note was a clear warning, but instead of scaring me, it fueled my resolve. Whoever was protecting the truth was desperate enough to try intimidation, which meant I was getting close. As I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the note, a single thought repeated in my mind. This isn't just about a mistake from the past, it's about power, control, and someone who doesn't want to be found. I knew I couldn't confront my parents again, not yet. If they were hiding something, they wouldn't tell me willingly. I had to go around them. The unknown caller. The next day, as I began piecing together what little I knew, my phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. Hello, I answered cautiously. You're making a mistake, a gravelly voice said. Who is this? I demanded, gripping the phone tightly. Stop looking into the past, the voice continued. You won't like what you find. Before I could respond, the line went dead. The call left me shaken but more determined than ever. If someone was willing to make direct threats, then the truth had to be bigger than I imagined. Diving deeper, I called James immediately. "We need to focus on my mother," I told him. "Whoever this person is, she's the key. Look into her life before she met my father. Every connection, every relationship, leave nothing out." James agreed, though he sounded wary. "You're playing a dangerous game," he warned. "Then let's make sure I win," I said. Uncovering the connection. A week later, James called with an update. "I found something," he said, "but you're not going to like it." When we met, he handed me a file filled with records from my mother's past, addresses, work history, and relationships I'd never heard of. But one name stood out: Vincent Hale. "Who's Vincent Hale?" I asked, flipping through the file. James's expression was grim. "He's a criminal. Drug trafficking, money laundering, racketeering. He's done it all. In the 1980s, he was one of the most powerful men in the region. Your mother worked for him as a secretary before she met your father." My stomach churned. "You're saying my mother was involved with a criminal?" James nodded. "It's more than that. Vincent disappeared in 1985, the same year Michael thought he was your father." A new lead. Vincent Hale's name opened a floodgate of possibilities. If he was my biological father, it would explain the secrecy, the lies, and the fear my mother had carried for decades. But it also raised a terrifying question. Was Vincent still alive? James dug deeper, using his contacts to track Vincent's movements. What he uncovered was chilling. Vincent had faked his death to evade law enforcement and had been living under an alias ever since. "Where is he now?" I asked. James hesitated. "He's in the city." The encounter. Armed with this information, I decided to confront Vincent directly. James strongly advised against it, but I couldn't wait any longer. If Vincent was the man behind the threats, I needed to face him. I found him at a high-end restaurant, sitting alone in a private booth. He looked like a man who had aged well, his sharp suit and confident demeanor betraying nothing of his criminal past. I approached cautiously. "Vincent Hale?" I asked. He looked up, his expression unreadable. "Who's asking?" "I'm Sam," I said, my voice steady. "Linda's son." For the first time, his composure faltered. "Linda?" he repeated, his voice soft. "Yes," I said, sliding into the seat across from him. "We need to talk." The conversation. Vincent studied me carefully, his piercing gaze making me feel exposed. "You've grown up," he said finally. "You look like her." "So you knew about me," I said. He nodded. "Of course, I knew the moment she told me she was pregnant." "Then why did you leave?" I demanded. His jaw tightened. "Because your mother wanted it that way. She was terrified of what my presence would mean for you, for her marriage, her family. She begged me to stay away, so I did." "But you didn't stay away, did you?" I pressed. "You've been watching us, threatening me." Vincent leaned back, his expression calm. "I've been protecting you," he said. A sinister revelation. "Protecting me from what?" I asked, my frustration boiling over. "From the people who would use you against me," Vincent said. "I made a lot of enemies in my time, and if they knew you existed, they'd come for you. Keeping you in the dark was the safest option." His words left me speechless. If what he was saying was true, then my entire life had been shaped by a man I didn't even know. The unexpected threat. As our conversation continued, Vincent's phone buzzed with a text. He glanced at it, his face darkening. "We have to leave," he said abruptly, standing up. "Why?" I asked, alarmed. "Because you've been followed," he said, "and if they find us together, it won't end well." Before I could process what was happening, Vincent grabbed my arm and led me out of the restaurant through a back entrance. A deadly chase. As we stepped into the alley, a black SUV screeched to a halt at the end of the street. Men in dark suits emerged, their intentions unmistakable. "Run," Vincent said, pushing me forward. "What about you?" I asked, panic rising. "I'll hold them off," he said. "Go!" Vincent shoved me toward the end of the alley, his voice calm but commanding. "Go, Sam! Don't look back!" The urgency in his tone snapped me out of my shock, and I ran. My heart pounded in my chest as my footsteps echoed off the brick walls. Behind me, the sound of shouting and the unmistakable crack of gunfire shattered the air. I reached the end of the alley and ducked into a side street, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Every instinct screamed at me to keep running, but I couldn't leave Vincent behind, not without answers. Vincent's sacrifice. Peering around the corner, I saw Vincent standing his ground, facing the men who had emerged from the SUV. His posture was relaxed, almost casual, but his eyes were sharp, calculating. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice steady, "let's not do anything we'll regret." The men didn't respond. One of them raised a weapon, and Vincent moved with startling speed, disarming him in seconds. The fight that followed was brutal, a chaotic blur of fists, grunts, and crashing bodies. I wanted to help, but I knew I'd be a liability. Vincent's movements were precise, honed by years of experience, and the last thing he needed was to worry about me. Finally, with the last man incapacitated, Vincent turned and ran toward me. The escape. "Come on," he said, grabbing my arm and pulling me down the street. We weaved through narrow alleys and side streets until we reached a small, nondescript car parked in a secluded lot. Vincent unlocked it and motioned for me to get in. As we drove away, the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a flood of questions. "Who were those men?" I asked, my voice trembling. "They're part of a group I used to work with," Vincent said, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. "When I left the business, I took something they wanted, information, and they've been hunting me ever since." The full extent of the danger. I stared at him, my mind racing. "And now they're after me because of you?" Vincent nodded grimly. "Your leverage. If they can't get to me, they'll use you to draw me out." The weight of his words hit me like a freight train. My entire life had been upended by secrets I didn't ask for, and now I was a pawn in a deadly game I barely understood. A safe house Vincent drove us to a secluded cabin deep in the woods, far from prying eyes. The place was Spartan but well equipped, with security cameras and reinforced locks. "This is where we'll stay for now," he said, checking the perimeter. "It's not perfect, but it'll buy us time." "Time for what?" I asked. "To figure out our next move," he said. The confession. That night, as the fire crackled in the cabin's small fireplace, Vincent finally opened up. "I never wanted this for you," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "When your mother told me she was pregnant, I was already in too deep. I thought leaving would protect you, but I underestimated how far they'd go." "Why did you stay in hiding?" I asked. "Why not tell me the truth?" "Because the truth would have put you in danger," he said, "and because your mother made it clear she didn't want me in your life. She thought she was protecting you." A dangerous plan. The next morning, Vincent laid out his plan. "They're not going to stop," he said. "The only way to end this is to take the fight to them." "What does that mean?" I asked, dreading the answer. "It means I have to face them," he said, "but I need your help to do it." My stomach churned at the thought of getting involved, but I knew there was no turning back. "What do you need me to do?" Vincent handed me a folder filled with documents, names, addresses, and details of his former associates. "These are the people pulling the strings," he said. "We need to expose them. If we can make their crimes public, they'll lose their power." The setup. Using the information in the folder, Vincent and I began setting a trap. We sent anonymous tips to journalists and law enforcement, planting seeds of suspicion about the organization's activities. At the same time, Vincent reached out to an old ally, someone he trusted to help us from the inside. "This is risky," I said as we prepared to execute the plan. "Everything worth doing is," Vincent replied. The final confrontation. The trap was set, A meeting with the organization's leaders, orchestrated to look like Vincent was surrendering. In reality, the location was rigged with hidden cameras and microphones, ready to capture everything. Vincent insisted I stay behind, but I refused. "I'm part of this now," I said. As we arrived at the meeting site, a dilapidated warehouse on the outskirts of the city, I felt the tension in the air. The betrayal. Inside, the leaders were waiting, their cold gazes fixed on Vincent. The meeting started tense but quickly turned hostile. "You think you can walk away from us?" one of them sneered. "You think we'll just let you go?" "I think you've underestimated me," Vincent replied, his voice calm. But just as the cameras captured their confessions, one of the men turned to me. "You really thought you could trust him?" he said, smirking. Before I could react, Vincent stepped forward, his face unreadable. "This was the only way," he said quietly. The tension in the warehouse was suffocating, every word laced with menace. The leaders of the organization stared at Vincent, their smirks growing as if they knew something I didn't. "You really thought you could outsmart us?" one of them sneered, his gaze shifting between Vincent and me. Vincent's face was a mask of calm, but his next words cut through me like a knife. "This was the only way," he said, his voice steady but void of emotion. "What are you talking about?" I demanded, my heart racing. Vincent turned to me, his expression softening just slightly. "I'm sorry, Sam," he said quietly, "but I had to make a choice." A father's sacrifice. Before I could respond, one of the men spoke up. "Vincent made a deal," he said, his smirk widening. "His life for yours. He brought you here to ensure we let him go." My chest tightened as the weight of their words sank in. I looked at Vincent, searching his face for any sign of denial, but he didn't meet my gaze. "You betrayed me?" I asked, my voice trembling with anger and disbelief. "This was never about betrayal," Vincent said, finally looking at me. "It's about survival. I couldn't let them hurt you, Sam, not after everything." A deadly twist. The leader stepped forward, gesturing for his men to grab me. "A noble gesture," he said mockingly, "but we don't make deals, Vincent. You should know that by now." Vincent's calm demeanor cracked, and for the first time I saw fear in his eyes. "We had an agreement," he said, his voice rising. The leader laughed coldly. "Did you really think you could trust us?" Chaos erupted as Vincent lunged at the nearest man, disarming him with practiced precision. "Run, Sam!" he shouted. I hesitated, my mind spinning, but the sound of gunfire jolted me into action. I ducked behind a stack of crates, my heart pounding as the fight unfolded. The escape through the chaos, I saw Vincent holding his own against the men, his movements swift and deliberate. He had lived a life of violence, and now it was clear why he had survived for so long. But even as he fought, I could see the odds stacking against him. There were too many of them, and I knew he couldn't hold them off forever. "Sam, go!" he shouted again, his voice cutting through the noise. Reluctantly, I scrambled toward the exit, my legs trembling with every step. As I reached the door, I turned back one last time. Vincent caught my eye, a fleeting look of regret and determination crossing his face. "I'm sorry," he mouthed, before the door slammed shut between us. A shocking revelation. I ran until I couldn't hear the gunfire anymore, collapsing against a wall in a nearby alley. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, fear, anger, confusion, but above all, a nagging sense that I still didn't know the full truth. As I caught my breath, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a message from an unknown number. "Meet me where it all began." Attached was a photo of the house I had grown up in. The final truth. When I arrived at the house, it was eerily quiet. The air felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were bracing for what was about to unfold. I entered cautiously, my heart racing with every step. In the living room, my mother was sitting on the couch, her face pale and tear-streaked. "You're back," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Where's Vincent?" I demanded, my anger boiling over. She looked down, her hands trembling. "He's gone," she said. "Gone where?" "He's dead," she admitted, her voice breaking. "He sacrificed himself to protect you." As her words sank in, my phone buzzed again. Another message from the same unknown number. "She's lying. Come to the warehouse." Without hesitation, I drove back to the scene of the fight, my mind racing with possibilities. When I arrived, the warehouse was deserted, but in the center of the room was a single chair, and Vincent, alive but bound and bloodied. "You shouldn't have come," he said weakly, his voice filled with regret. Before I could respond, a figure stepped out of the shadows. It was the leader of the organization, a smug grin on his face. "Welcome to the real game," he said. The truth revealed. The leader's next words shattered everything I thought I knew. "Vincent didn't betray you," he said. "Your mother did. She's the one who told us where to find you. She's the one who's been playing both sides from the start." My blood ran cold as I remembered her cryptic words, her tears, her endless lies. "Why would she do that?" I demanded. "To protect herself," the leader said. "She was one of us once. She knew the only way to stay safe was to give us what we wanted, Vincent." The final choice. The leader stepped closer, his tone mockingly sympathetic. "So, Sam, what's it going to be? Walk away and you live. Stay and you'll die alongside dear old Dad." I looked at Vincent, his eyes filled with guilt and pain. Despite everything, he had tried to protect me. But now, the choice was mine. The leader's words hung in the air, heavy with menace. Vincent sat in the chair, his face battered but defiant, while I stood frozen, my mind racing. The truth about my mother's betrayal, the years of deception, and the life I thought I understood had unraveled in mere moments. But now I had to decide. Walk away and save myself, or stay and risk everything for a man I barely knew, a man who had lied to me but had also tried to protect me. The weight of the past. "I don't understand," I said, my voice trembling as I looked at Vincent. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you warn me about her?" Vincent's head drooped and his voice was low and pained. "I wanted to believe she could change," he said, "that after everything she would protect you. I never thought she'd sell us both out to save herself." The leader laughed, the sound cold and sharp. "Sentimental fool," he said. "You've been running your whole life, Vincent. Did you really think you could keep him safe forever?" The offer. The leader turned to me, his expression almost amused. "Here's how this works, Sam," he said. "You walk out of here, and this ends for you. No more digging, no more threats. You get to live your life in peace." "And Vincent?" I asked, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "He stays," the leader said simply. "We have unfinished business." I clenched my fists, my breath coming in short bursts. "What if I don't leave?" The leader's grin widened. "Then you'll join him. And trust me, we have plenty of room for both of you." Vincent's plea. "Sam, go," Vincent said, his voice hoarse. "Don't throw your life away for me. This is my fight, not yours." I looked at him, my mind torn between anger and pity. "You dragged me into this," I said, my voice breaking. "You made me question everything about my life, and now you want me to walk away." Vincent's eyes softened. "You deserve better than this," he said. "I've made my mistakes, but you don't have to pay for them. Please, Sam, walk away." The turning point. As the leader's men closed in, something inside me snapped. All the pain, the lies, the betrayals. They had taken everything from me, my family, my identity, my sense of safety. And now they wanted me to give up the only thing I had left, my choice. "No," I said, my voice firm. The leader raised an eyebrow. "No?" "I'm not leaving," I said, stepping forward. "If you want him, you'll have to go through me." Vincent's eyes widened in shock. Sam, don't. But it was too late. The leader's smug grin disappeared, replaced by a cold, calculating glare. Brave, he said. Stupid, but brave. The fight. The next moments were a blur. One of the men lunged at me and I reacted instinctively, using the self-defense training Vincent had taught me. I wasn't a fighter, but adrenaline and desperation fueled me. Vincent, still tied to the chair, yelled instructions. "Behind you, block left." I followed his guidance, managing to evade most of the blows. But the numbers were against me, and it wasn't long before I was overwhelmed. Just as one of the men raised a weapon, Vincent broke free of his restraints with a roar of determination. He tackled the man, disarming him in seconds. The final confrontation. With Vincent fighting beside me, the tide began to turn. We worked together, taking down the men one by one. But the leader wasn't done yet. He pulled a gun from his coat, aiming it at Vincent. "Enough!" he shouted. "This ends now." Time seemed to slow as I saw the gun pointed at Vincent. Without thinking, I stepped between them, shielding him with my body. The leader hesitated, his finger hovering over the trigger. "Move, kid," he said. "You don't have to die for him." "No," I said, my voice steady. "But I'll die fighting for the truth." The final twist. Before the leader could fire, the sound of sirens filled the air. Red and blue lights flashed outside the warehouse, and the leader's men scattered like rats. Vincent turned to me, a mixture of relief and pride in his eyes. "You called them?" he asked. I nodded. "Before we came here, I had to have a backup plan." The leader glared at me, his smirk replaced by fury. "You think this ends here?" he snarled. "This is bigger than you can imagine." "I'll take my chances," I said, as the police burst through the doors, arresting him and his remaining men. The aftermath. In the weeks that followed, the truth about Vincent's past and the organization's crimes made headlines. My mother disappeared, her betrayal cutting deeper than I thought possible. Vincent and I began rebuilding our fractured relationship, slowly but surely. He wasn't the perfect father, but he was trying, and for now, that was enough. A new beginning. As I sat in my apartment one evening, reflecting on everything that had happened, my phone buzzed with a message. The truth is a powerful thing. Guard it carefully. V. I smiled, knowing that while the fight was over, the scars it left would remain. But for the first time in my life, I felt like I understood who I was, and I was ready to face whatever came next.